Okay, let's get started. Can everyone hear me okay? Looks good, all right. Thanks for coming, everyone. This is how to be a gameplay programmer that designers will love. I'm Matthew Rowland. A little bit about me. I'm the gameplay programmer at League of Geeks. I've been there for about 3 years now. And for about the last 2 years, I've been responsible for implementing the bulk of the new gameplay systems that have gone in, pretty much ever since we went to full release, and I sort of became the gameplay programmer, I guess, as an official title. And so most of my job is working closely with the designers to expand the game while maintaining its core fantasy of being a digital card and board game with a strong fantasy sort of Game of Thrones Kung Fu Panda vibe, to use our trade show spiel. These lovely gentlemen, there's at least one of them in the audience today, so I better be nice to them, are the directors of League of Geeks and also form the sort of core vision holders for the project. So when I talk about the designers, it's mostly these three that I'm talking about. So a bit about the talk. It's a tech talk, but it's going to also be covering bits of soft skills and a bit of sort of design applications, along with communication techniques, programming tips, and yeah, the design stuff. And the main thing to note about the design team at League of Geeks is that they're all non-technical designers. They're definitely not programmers. Only one of them usually has Unity installed on their computer at any given time. So most of what I'm saying today is specific to that relationship and that dynamic. So I'm just going to call them designers from now on, though. If I just say designers, it means non-technical designers for the purposes of this talk. So why is it important for a gameplay programmer and a designer to be able to work together well? From my point of view, they're two of the most closely integrated roles in all of game dev. A designer needs a programmer in order to realize their vision. And you can't realize a vision effectively unless you work closely together and collaborate in an effective way. If you have a combative relationship, the game's not going to be any good. They communicate, because of that, they communicate more than a lot of other disciplines. You know, certainly I talk to the designers a lot more than I talk to the audio team, for example. But they're also two of the most different roles in game dev. Programmers, you know, very hard skill oriented, a very different educational background and professional background compared to designers that tend to specialize in more soft skills. And I actually think it's a real shame that that the education systems for these two roles don't overlap more and give them more of a common standing to communicate, because too many graduates end up in the industry without these, without this knowledge and without these skills. And you know, miscommunications between any roles, but especially between ones that have to collaborate so closely, can be costly and frustrating and can really lead to unpleasant working environments if it's done poorly. So what exactly is a good gameplay programmer expected to provide to a team? And I would argue that so yeah, obviously you work closely with designers in order to realize their vision. And part of that is helping them find the best solutions. The definition of a best solution is very nebulous and varies from decision to decision, but we'll come back to that a bit later in the talk. You have to be able to communicate your reasoning effectively. It's not good enough just to say, this is what I think the best decision is. You have to be able to convince them of why that is and why, what knowledge it is that you have that they don't, that they need to consider when really choosing that outcome. You need to be able to multiply the value of your designer's work. If you get more content out of a given hour of design work, then your designer's going to be less stressed, and they're stressed enough as it is. Your game is going to end up with more content, or you're going to have more time to polish that content than if you spend the entire dev cycle just stuck in that design process and not, you know, reaching the shipping and polishing the game stage. You have to multiply the value of your own work. There's a lot of programming to do in a video game, and the most important thing to do is work smarter and not harder. No one wants to crunch. So if you can do an hour's worth of work that gets you 6 hours worth of value, that's better than doing 8 hours worth of work. You've got to fill the gaps in design. We're going to come back to this a bit later as well, but designers, just like everyone, they're not infallible. They can't foresee everything that's going to happen over the course of a 1 to 6 year dev cycle. And so gaps are going to come up. And it's your job to help them fill those gaps and take some of that load off of their plate. And I guess eventually you'll do some programming as well. So I'm going to start out talking about communication. That byline is actually from a talk by Brian Schwab and goes into this in a lot more detail. It's from GDC 2014. So if you're interested in going a deeper dive on this, then definitely check out that talk. I think there's a link in the slides a bit further down. But the role of communication between, the importance of communication between these two roles is often underestimated. A lot of studios work in a way where the designer will write up a big brief and they'll hand it to the programmer and they'll expect you to just implement it, and there's never any communication back and forth until the brief is done, and that's when you find the problems, which is way too late. And yeah, like if you have, especially if you have multiple designers and multiple gameplay programmers working on a project, having that communication between the teams and between each other is necessary to create a coherent product and make sure that your design goals and your programming styles aren't at odds with each other. And the relationship can often be prone to stereotypes, distrust, and egos. You know, I'm not going to say that only programmers are egotistical or only designers are egotistical, but it can, you know, it can go a bit both ways, and you got to really be careful of that and make sure that it's taken out of the equation so no one gets into a combative frame of mind. And there's that link to the Brian Schwab talk. I don't know how to say his name. I'm sorry if he ever hears this. Probably not. Yeah, we communicate differently, and that should be seen as a strength and a benefit, because if you have people who have the same backgrounds and the same experiences and the same conversational styles, then you're going to miss the problems that a different perspective would have highlighted. But there's this stigma, and even in this image, you can see that both people are angry at each other, right? And why does it have to be like that? Why is everyone mad all the time when, like, are you arguing? Why are these two people? So these are actually the comments from Brian's talk. They listened to this talk and they still are like getting into a fight in the comments section. I don't know what I expected from YouTube, but it's really, really unfortunate. So what can we do to alleviate this? As in any communications, this is not at all specific, this tip, to this relationship, but face-to-face conversations are absolutely crucial when you're dealing with things that are contentious or things that are complicated or things that might be difficult to convey in text. Anyone who's on Twitter knows how hard it can be to convey nuance and convince people of things that you feel strongly about when you can't have a dialogue in a synchronous fashion. And so, like, we run into this problem a lot. League of Geeks is a dispersed team. We have people working overseas often. We have people working from home often. And so we use Slack for the majority of our conversations. But whenever the designers and I or any of the other programmers come up to one of these decisions, we make sure that we can have a voice conversation. And if we can both be in the studio and have a face-to-face conversation, then that's the best. But you know, if we have to resort to a video call or a phone call or something, that's still infinitely better than trying to pass a design document around or have a conversation on Slack. When you are a programmer explaining something to a designer, it can be easy to fall into the trap of burying them in jargon to try to convince them that you know what you're talking about. And that's no good, because that's it's patronizing, and they're not going to be convinced by something that they don't understand and don't believe that you're making any realistic effort to convey to them. But it can also be too easy to go the other way and resort to basicallys and abstractions that don't actually provide them any real information either. You have to trust that they're going to know that you know what you're talking about, and that you can convince them of that in a reasonable way. And remember, basic logic isn't technical. As long as you don't bury them in jargon and programming terms and whatever, you'll be able to get across the reasoning of your decision without going into the specifics of pointers and whatever else. And on the other side, when they're communicating to you a gameplay system or something that they want, you have to understand why they want it and not just what they want. And this is important because if you understand why they want it, then you can anticipate their needs whenever questions come up, instead of running to them every 2 minutes with a question about something that they didn't outline in enough detail maybe in the initial brief, because like I said, they can never cover every single edge case. So yeah, it helps you fill the gaps in the design, and it helps you not to waste your time and their time by suggesting alternatives that are never going to pass their design checks because they're not addressing the same goal as what they were facing in the first place. And this is partly their responsibility as well, to be willing to have a dialogue with you and tell you why they want something. So if your designers are pushing back on that and saying, no, just do it, make sure that they understand that, that you want this so you can help them better. You don't just want it for the sake of it. You're not just trying to waste their time with more explanations. And yeah, design is a collaboration, so you need to, both parties need to be willing to collaborate. I recently saw in an interview with Yoshio Sakamoto, who was a programmer on the Super Metroid for the SNES in the interview series that Nintendo released with the SNES Mini. He said, designers don't need to know about tech. If they do, they'll start claiming something is impossible before they try, and that's no good. And this is probably a bit of an old-fashioned way of thinking, partly because it comes from the Super Nintendo days, it's decades ago, but it highlights sort of what I'm talking about here, that you need to, like, they need to be having the dialogue, but they don't need to be trying to account for technical issues before talking to you. If they're filtering out these design possibilities because they assume it'll be impossible, maybe that's because they think that you won't have the conversation with them, or that you'll not be open to a dialogue about how to solve that problem. And in a similar way, Clint Hocking, in his 2008 GDC rant, told an anecdote about when he was wrestling with a design problem and was trying to solve it all himself. And finally he went and asked the gameplay programmer if he thought that his solution would be possible. And the programmer said, dude, it's code, we can do anything. And it's important, luckily my designers have seen this talk and took it to heart, and Trent likes to joke that him having seen that will forever make my job more difficult, but I would rather him have that perspective than be not even suggesting things for the sake of trying to save me work or something. That's not how good games get made. So in terms of multiplying your own effort, like I said, you've got to work smarter. So when you're programming, there are a couple of main goals that you are trying to achieve, and these first two apply to pretty much any programmer. You're trying to maximize your bang for buck. How much value are you getting out of every code hour that you're putting in? And you want to avoid repeated or wasted work. Those two are pretty obvious. But as a gameplay programmer, when you're working with a designer, you also want to be empowering them to recognize their visions. And that one is not something that I see mentioned as much, and not something that everyone seems to take into account when they're writing their code. So I'm going to go quickly through two techniques that I've found to hit all three of these goals at once and not try to waste anyone's time. The first is prototyping, and the second is building systems versus building bespoke solutions. So prototyping, it seems obvious. Everyone knows about prototyping, but many people seem to stop prototyping after pre-production and thinking, okay, we're in production code now. I have to be writing all my code to work right the first time because this will get shipped. And I want to tell you that's ridiculous. If you are 3 years into a project or 4 years into a project like we are with Armello now, we still prototype things all the time, and it results in a better game. So imagine these two workflows. I'll just go through this real quick, but I think everyone understands prototyping. If the designer gives the brief, the programmer implements it, the artists and the audio team get a hand on it, and then the designer finally gets to see it, then if the designer decides that that hasn't addressed their vision, then all that work is wasted and you go back to the drawing board. But if the designer and programmer collaborate to identify potential problems and what questions need to be answered by a prototype, the programmer does that just in a hacky way with throwaway code, do it in a different branch on Git if you're worried about accidentally shipping bugs or something, and then sit down together and evaluate the prototype and see whether that is the course you want to go forward. Much less wasted work, much less heartbreak when you throw away code that you put your heart and soul into. And so for an example of this in Armello, this is the Bear Clan. Heroes in, oh, the fonts have really messed up. The heroes in Armello have one defining gameplay ability that is meant to define their play style. And they're notoriously difficult to balance. They have to be unique, they have to be fun, they have to be balanced with each other so the community doesn't yell at us, and they have to be evocative of their role. And the Bear Clan's been historically difficult, maybe because they're magic users or whatever, and their design space is much bigger for them. So historically, we've prototyped them. Sana had 2 different abilities. Brun had 3 different attempts before we nailed it right. And when we got to Gore, we didn't have time to prototype it, so we shipped our first instinct. It looked fine on paper, but he ended up too powerful, and people hated him, and then we had to nerf him, and now people don't play him very much. And you know, he's one of the most contentious heroes in the whole game, not only in the community, but also internally as well. So prototype, you know, if we'd prototyped his ability, we would have had time to refine it before shipping it, and we wouldn't have, you know, had to scramble to find a solution after he had shipped. Yeah, it's not a coincidence that he is the most problematic. So next I'm going to talk about systems versus bespoke solutions. Again, systems have some pretty obvious advantages that apply to all programming. It reduces the cost of implementing new permutations of that system. It improves the maintainability of the code if you've got more gameplay features sharing code paths. But importantly, it also can reveal design space. So what I mean by this is if a designer gives you a brief and you go ahead, I'll use a specific example from Armello. When I first joined the project, pretty much all the card effects in the game were instant effects. They dealt 2 damage, or they gave you 2 gold or something, very, you know, contained. And one of the first cards that I implemented was something that would buff you for 2 turns. It gave you two more attack or something. And what I could have done easily would be to implement that as a once-off effect, fully contained in its own code, where it makes itself expire and takes away your attack at the end of the turn. But what I did instead was I spent an extra maybe hour total on building a system with a manager that would expire that with some designer specifiable things in the Unity prefab. And you know, it's just super simple. I didn't go and add a bunch of permutations that weren't necessary. It was just, okay, this will expire at the end of how many turns. And what that revealed was that I could go to the designers afterwards and say, okay, first of all, if you ever want to add another effect with a duration, this is now super easy. This will cost us no time. You can do it yourself, basically. But what I could also say was, we can now expire status effects, as I called them, on pretty much any condition we want. So now in the game, as a result of, maybe not as a result of me saying this, but I like to believe that I get the credit, we have effects that expire when you equip cards. We have effects that expire when you step onto a certain tile type on the board. We have ones that expire at dawn and dusk. We have, like, you know, 7 or 8 different expiry types that potentially the designers wouldn't have considered as valid design space had I not gone to that extra 1 hour of effort to start a system around expiring effects. And you know, I would say that's a pretty low cost for what we eventually got out of it. So the only real disadvantage that I see to systems is that they have a higher upfront cost. So it's not a no-brainer. You don't want to put in a bunch of upfront cost if you end up never reusing that system. So you have to make a decision at some point. And so how do you make that decision? I would caution against just asking the designer. Like I said, they can't anticipate everything that they're going to want. I've heard stories of effects that started out as what seemed like a once-off thing becoming core gameplay systems a year later. And if you've written that code in a way that's completely unextensible, then you've probably created a huge headache for yourself. So instead, you often have to learn the rules for your specific environment. And this will come with time from working with your designers. But in Armello, for example, the hero powers I was talking about before, they're unique and they're character defining. So we very rarely reuse effects that are created for hero powers. And what that means is that in the code, we have a bunch of stuff like this where we're referencing the power ID of the heroes specifically in a way that's not extensible at all, but I know that we're not going to use that again. And if we do, I can come back and revisit it, but we'll get to that in a minute. I can usually make that decision safe in the knowledge that I'm not shooting myself in the foot when it's a hero power. By comparison, card effects. We've got 130-odd cards in the game, and so obviously a lot of them are reusing systems. So this is an export that I did yesterday of all the cards in the game by their card effect type. The left column there is things that I would call a system that can be reused and designer specified, and the things on the right are bespoke effects. Sometimes there's systems in the background that mean that some of those effects share code, but as far as designers are concerned, they're unique effects. And so you can see at the top of the left column, 108 of our 130-odd cards use status effects. So we got a lot of value out of that system, and it didn't cost much upfront to implement. And if I break down those status effect cards, because we have status effect types as well, we can see a similar thing. There's dice buffs right at the top, which cover pretty much all combat effects. And yeah, something like half of the status effects in the game use that type, and there's a bunch of different permutations you can have in there. It's very, very powerful, and designers can basically implement a new card without me touching the code at all. Sometimes some of these aren't used very often. That might be a problem. That might mean that I wasted time implementing a system for those ones, or it might mean that it was almost no cost for me to implement that, and so I did it anyway in case we ever want to do it. And there's probably a mixture of those two things in there. What's next? So there will be edge cases where you're not sure whether you should build a system or not. There won't always be good rules like Armello, and even when there are, you'll hit edge cases anyway. So how do you make that decision if you're not sure? So if it's easy to implement a system, if it would cost you nothing, basically, if you wouldn't need to ask your producer, can I have a bit more time to work on this, then just do it. Because the benefits of having that system in place far outweigh that extra half hour you'll spend on it. Maybe don't tell the producer just in case they get upset, but most of them should be okay with it. But what if it's not easy? What I tend to do is I implement the effect bespoke, but I make sure that I'm not shooting myself in the foot as much as possible. I try to avoid the kind of hacks that you saw in the hero power code where I'm referring to things directly, and I try to make sure I'm a good past Matt so that future Matt doesn't travel back in time if that happens. But most importantly, you should know the costs of systemization, and that should be easy, because if you've made the decision not to systemize it, you must have had a reason to make that decision. And all this really is then is keeping that in mind. Maybe record it somewhere if you have good documentation tools. Maybe it's easy enough to keep it in mind. Maybe you can just put a comment in the code. But you need to know those costs, and that can come in a variety of forms. It might just be dev time. It might be that it'll make the code more complex. It might be that it'll introduce a bunch of tech debt. Maybe it has external costs like servers or something if it's a really intense feature. But you need to know those so that if a designer comes to you and says, hey, I want to make a system out of that thing you did last year, that you can tell them why it may or may not be a good idea, and you can give them the knowledge to make the best decision, like we were talking about earlier. They can't know all that information without you there to provide it for them. So we talked about how to empower yourself, but how do you empower your designers? So yeah, we said earlier, you have to help them find the best solutions. And that might just be the most fun solution, but you also have to weigh up the cost for the value that you'll get, any technical limitations. These are the kinds of things that only you can provide to them. So that information can't come from one person. You also need to fill the gaps. So my dad told me when I was younger, there's nothing worse than having to micromanage someone. If I went to work with him, I did my work experience at my dad's work, which was a equipment hire company. And he told me to go and sweep the workshop floor. And every 5 minutes or so, I would come back to him and say, oh, should I sweep over there? Should I sweep over there? Do you want me to also clean this thing while I'm over there that's not sweeping? You know, I better check to make sure I'm doing the right thing. And now, with hindsight, I can see that was incredibly annoying. And your designers will have the same feeling. If they give you a brief and you go to implement it, and every 5 minutes you're coming back and saying, how do you want to handle this? Did you consider that? Then they're just going to get sick of you, and you're increasing their switching cost. They're trying to do something else because they're moving on to designing the next feature or something, and you're constantly making them pull all that information about the other system back into their heads. And really, it's your job not to do that. Like we said earlier, you should understand why they want it, so you should be able to make the answers to these questions for them, and just check in at the end. You present to them a finished feature, you say, these are the things that weren't covered in the brief, this is the decision that I made regards to that, and this is why, importantly, this is why I did it, so that they don't even have to look at the decision you made and try to figure out why you did it, and then decide if that was the right decision. They should just be able to say, and especially this will get more and more common as you work together longer, yes, that was the right decision, cool, we'll move on, and everyone's happy, no one's wasted their time. So this is where, if there are any designers in the room, you might start to disagree with me a bit more, but I like to refer to the gameplay programmer as the gatekeeper of design. Put your hands up if you are a gameplay programmer in the room. I imagine most people, yes. Put your hands up if you have some interest in design. Even more people than the gameplay programmers, yes. Put your hands up if you call yourself a designer. Not as many, not much overlap. I'm here to tell you that everyone who said you're a gameplay programmer, you're a designer as well. You have to be. That's part of the job. You can't do your job well if you're not a designer. And that's because as the project goes on, you're going to be the one with potentially the best understanding of the gameplay systems, how they interact with each other, where that design space is. You've seen the code and they haven't. And so you know what you're in prime position to say, hey, that suggestion, that new idea that you're briefing up, I have this concern about how it'll interact with this other system and how it's going to also cost us a month's work in the future to resolve this other issue so we can keep developing, or something like that. And then, not only that, but because you're trying to create solutions and not problems, you don't just want to say that's not good enough, you have to come up with something else. You want to go to them with an alternative. Never go to a designer with telling them that their thing's no good unless you have an alternative. Because, again, once you've worked together for a while and you've refined that relationship, you can give them an alternative that will at least get them moving on the right track if they don't just say, that's a great idea outright, and, you know, everyone moves on. Or you collaborate and have a conversation and come out the other end with the solution. But it's so important to be on the same page. If you don't understand the vision for the project, if you're not all up in their heads about that kind of thing, then you're going to create that kind of antagonistic relationship where they feel like you're pushing back arbitrarily, or they feel like you're trying to steal their job or something, which is obviously not the case most of the time. And so your design skills should be seen as an asset to the team and not a liability or a threat. So the last thing I want to talk about today is tools. Building tools is probably the best way to multiply your work, both for you and for your designer. But there are a few gotchas that you've got to be careful of that can make tool development actually a huge waste of time. So the first thing is you have to make sure that the tools will be used. An unused tool is worse than no tool at all because it cost you time to make it, and then it didn't save anyone time. And the best way to do that is to make sure you're fixing the right problems. If you fix a problem that isn't actually a problem, then it's not gonna get used, right? And also, like the Excel thing and the subtitle, some designers just don't want to change their workflow. So you might think you're giving them the best, most awesome tool in the world and it'll cut their workflow in, okay, if it cuts it in half, they probably should be using it. But if it's just going to save them a little bit of time and they're just more comfortable not learning a new thing, then they're not going to use it, and you're better off maybe like finding something else that will help them. Maybe if they prefer to work in Excel, build an Excel exporter instead of a whole separate tool. So how do you identify the right problems? The obvious thing not to do is ignore the problem. Yes, there's a meme. What a lot of people do is assume the problems. Often there's a feeling that as a programmer you can see, you know what the designer is going to be doing with what you've written, so therefore you must know what problems they're going to get, and you just try to fix them preemptively, and then it turns out it's not a problem at all. So that's like okay, but it's not great. You should ask about the designer's problems, because not only will that give you their actual feedback, but also often designers won't realize, or anyone for that matter, not just designers, this applies to artists and audio and whatever as well, they won't realize that there is a way that their workflow could be improved until you have a conversation with them about it. But the absolute ultimate thing you can do is observe them using the workflow and using like going through what they do on a day-to-day basis and see what problems they run into that they might not even notice. It's the same principle as testing and you know, like having control groups and not control groups, you know what I mean, testing groups for your game. You don't rely on what they tell you afterwards. You rely on the vision of watching them play the game to see what was going wrong, because often the person encountering the problem can't identify it as well as you can. So I've got two examples here of tools that were built for Armello. The first one is a chat editor that I built. It was intended to help the writers putting chat lines that are used in the game directly into the game instead of writing it somewhere else and having to copy-paste it later. It's never been used by anyone except me. Because I didn't ask them if they wanted it. They don't like opening Unity. They don't like having Unity installed. It costs them a lot of time. They don't have a license, so they don't get the nice dark theme. So I should have asked them first, then I wouldn't have wasted that time. There was a much more egregious example that I couldn't get a screenshot of because we stopped supporting it, which was a quest editor that was really complicated and also never got used. And that, you know, that's probably a week of a programmer's time to make a tool that no one used. On the other hand, here we have a string table importer that Tom wrote maybe only 2 or 3 months ago. And that is intended to import a CSV from our localizers and put it into our string tables automatically and resolve any conflicts and whatever. And for 2.5 years, we were, or Trent mostly, was manually using Beyond Compare to import these CSVs one line at a time. And he had never thought to ask, is there a faster way that we can do this? And it took Tom probably half a day less to implement this, and now it saves us hours every time we do a patch. And it just goes to show like how even the most obvious of problems just sometimes won't come up unless you ask about it. So the next thing to do is make sure you're not making engineer tools. I meant to get a screenshot of like a really bad microwave interface or something here. Like, you know, everyone's seen those kind of things that are obviously designed by engineers and have no thought to UX put into them. But there are a few ways to recognize them in your code as well. If your tool is hard to understand or not intuitive, if things aren't labeled because you're just like, oh, I know what it does, you know, it all seems obvious, but if it solves a problem that no one's actually got a problem with, or I think crucially, if it lets the designer break the game, then it's an engineer tool. It's easy to put in, to allow like, you know, any number to put anywhere and any combination of options to be selected because you know which ones will break the game, but the designer doesn't know, and at some point they're going to get curious and start experimenting, and if the build breaks when a programmer hasn't touched it, then it can be really hard to track down why. Everyone's like, oh, who checked in a thing that would break it? And you go scrolling back through, and then there's like something from an email that's not set up correctly because they've got Git, but they didn't know how to set it up right, and you can't tell who it is. It's not a good experience for the designer either, because they probably spent an hour trying to play with this tool to get a cool new effect to happen, and all they did was cause problems for people. So that's super important. Here I've got, I'm sorry, Justin, to pick on you. I've got a good example and a bad example from the AI system in Armello. What we've got at the top is there are 3 decks in Armello, and this is how we tell the AI which decks they should be drawing from. So the top example is really good because everything's clearly labeled. We've got sliders to limit the value ranges to reasonable values. It tells you clearly there that it's self-normalizing. So even if you put in 1, 1, 1, your AI aren't going to draw 3 times as many cards. You can't break the game with this tool. And so it's a perfect example of what to do right. Directly underneath that, we have an excerpt, a small excerpt from the list of modifiers that the AI consider when deciding where to move. And as you can see, some of them are labeled okay, some of them are labeled not so great. The value ranges are all over the place. There's no bounds set on them. To look at that, you'd have no idea what to change in order to get the desired effect. You don't know if they're being added to values or multiplied to values or subtracted or whatever. And changing the wrong value in there, some of them are never meant to be touched by designers. So changing the wrong value could actually just make the AI stop moving entirely. And that's obviously not good if a designer just wants to come in and tweak, you know, how much they want to go on dungeons or something. But when trying to fix that problem of making the tools understandable, it can be easy to fall into the trap of setting arbitrary limitations on your designers. As the programmer, you can't always foresee what a reasonable combination of values is. So it's important to let the designer do anything that won't outright break the game. And I actually made a mistake in this when trying to fix the AI problem. I decided that I would simplify everything down to multipliers, and I would set it from 0 to 2. So things can either be twice as attractive or like, you know, ignored entirely or anywhere in between. But looking at that now, it's obvious that a designer might want an AI to consider health to be twice as important as spirit, for example, and they can't do that because of an arbitrary limitation that I set on them. So be careful not to limit them either. You want to open the design space, not close it down. So some quick takeaways for you. You're there to collaborate with the designers. Very good font. Thank you for overlapping the title. Sometimes in tech and sometimes in design. Both of those are, I would say, equally important. You know, tech is something that you can only you can provide to them, and design, 2 people working on something is so much more fruitful than 1 person working on something always. Collaboration is impossible without good 2-way communication, which requires effort on both sides. Everyone needs to be committed to making that relationship work. And you need to be taking initiative and solving problems instead of passing them on. Passing the buck is always bad, so if you've got the skills to solve something, you should be doing it. You are a designer. Don't let them tell you otherwise. But don't be nasty about it either. You know, it's a good relationship. Building systems saves everyone time and opens up design space, makes the game better. Prototyping reduces wasted work no matter what stage of the project you're at. And build tools, but do it to solve actual problems. So that's all I've got for today. So we've got some time for questions, if anyone has any. Yes?
Are there any tools when working in Unity that you would consider to be like a must-build for a gameplay programmer?
It really depends on your game, I think. I can't think of any off the top of my head that would be universally applicable. you know, for Armello, there are some no-brainers, like, for example, letting designers tweak card values and costs and stuff like that is really, really obvious. If everything is hidden in code, then they just can't work effectively. And there will be those kind of no-brainers for every situation. Things like AI, probably most, like, you know, if you've got any kind of AI in the game, it makes sense to have tools for that. But I think it's hard to think of any that would be completely universally applicable. Anyone else? Yes? Blake? Blake is one of the directors at League of Geeks, and I've never called him pig-headed, I will have him know. Patience goes a long way, because you know what, if you think they're being pig-headed, they probably think you're being pig-headed as well, and chances are both of you are a little bit. Take a break from the conversation and come back later with a clear mind, and use that time to think through what they're saying objectively, you know? Try to find the why. Maybe you haven't stopped to consider the why, maybe you're only looking at the what, and trust that they'll be doing the same thing with that time. And when you go back together, you'll have a more productive conversation as a result. All right, I allowed too much time for questions. But that's fine. That means we can all go. Oh, yes. I've got a very big soft spot for Sargon because I tend to like designs that are a little bit gross and don't appeal to people. My favorite Pokemon is like that terrible barnacle thing that no one likes with like 5 heads. So yeah, Sargon's definitely my pick with all the scabby skin and everything. Yes. Yeah, I mean, as with anything production related, that comes largely with experience. The more familiar you are with the code base and with what systems are already in place, the more accurate your estimates are going to be. If you're pitched something that you really have no idea, then this is something that we've historically had problems with, as you know, but doing spikes where you can to try to fill your knowledge gaps and find out if there are any tools that you can use to try to cut down on that time, and if there's not, then making sure that you allow the appropriate amount of time for learning, because if you don't know if you've never implemented something like that before, then you're going to be learning, there's going to be a learning process, and that's going to make it take longer. So probably my generalist advice on that would be allow more time than you think. And that's what I tend to try to do. Yes?
Say you've come up with a system that's quite complex that you think is going to be very valuable, and designers have agreed that's very valuable. How have you gone about convincing producers that it's worth investing in building that?
Luckily at League of Geeks, or maybe unluckily, depending on how you look at it, I don't know if our producers are here, the directors can pretty much just say, we're going to do it. It hasn't been my job to do that convincing. If I have to convince the designers of something that I think is valuable but is complex, then it's all those same kind of tips that are already in the talk about make sure they understand why you want to do it, make sure they understand why it's going to take that long, and convince them that you've looked at the alternatives that would be faster and why you think that that extra time is worthwhile. It's about making sure you've done the due diligence and haven't just come to them with a solution that isn't thought out and you're trying to get away with it by saying, oh, don't worry, I know it'll take a long time, but kind of thing. Does that make sense? Yeah. Yes?
It may be a whole other talk, but is there anything that you as a gameplay designer really appreciate when the designers
yeah, so obviously when they are open to that kind of relationship. I'm incredibly lucky at League of Geeks that all 3 designers sort of understood this already, I think, and it actually took me longer to understand that that they were appreciating my input on design. When I joined the company, was very much oh, I'm a programmer, I better keep my opinions on this stuff to myself unless it's really techie or something. So I've very much appreciated them encouraging me to come into this kind of role. But the other thing I would say is when they actively seek to use the opportunities that you presented to them, that is just really, really rewarding. You know, if to go back to that status effect example, if I had done that little system to allow that expiring condition and then we ended up with one card using it in the game, that's kind of a disappointing thing, right? Because if you've done this system, you probably see the potential in it. So yeah, when they take the time to step away from their own ideas and look at the design space that you've tried to open up for them, that's, I think, a really rewarding thing. Yeah. Yes?
What do you think about training designers to do their own prototypes?
It depends a lot on what tools they're using. I guess, you know, there could be a really strong argument for like getting them into using Twine or, you know, Sketch, what's that, Sketch or whatever, that other one, that something that's very low code that they can use to make prototypes of something that will eventually go into Unity, yeah. But it depends entirely on whether they're interested in it or not. I think it's a similar argument to the tools thing. If they're not interested, then trying to get them to do it is just going to be a waste of time and frustrate them. If they are into it, then you should be doing absolutely everything you can to encourage it, because it will save everyone time in the long run. But there's no point forcing it on someone who's not interested. Yeah. All right, looks like it. Thank you very much for coming, everyone. Hit me up on Twitter if you've got any questions.